Alright, we're going to take a look at a plugin for SailPoint. It's a UI Angular JS plugin with some REST services. This is what it looks like. It has a link over here that you can get to it. And basically it's looking for all the managed attributes that you might be the owner of. We'll get into that later on. So very simple UI. It's based on the To-Do plugin, but I dumbed it down so that I could learn how to do this, since I'm more of a back-end developer, not so much an Angular JS person. The To-Do plugin was a little too complicated, but once I worked this thing out, now I got a much better idea how this works. So we have a UI plugin that, based on a link, it fires up a REST service. The REST service gathers up some data, and then Angular JS displays this. And you can view some data in the managed attribute, and then of course you have the database over here. So when it's certified, you don't see it, and then you can certify it, and you see it's been certified. And then if we go back here and look, certified, now we can reset, and it's back to certify. Okay, now it gets, this was a demonstration only to set it and reset it. You probably would want to reset it through the UI. But anyway, this is what it looks like, and we'll take a look at it in depth. All right, let's take a look at some important things here first. So here's a pretty good document on how to create custom attributes. And the one thing they forgot here at the end was adding it to the object config. So you want to make sure you do that afterwards, or you'll get a bunch of errors on startup. Even though without it, though, it still seemed to work, but it's better to put those in. All right, so you see the URL here, but I think this is community, so you may have to be a member of Compass. And then over here, well, we're not looking at that right now. Over here, we have the plugin developer's guide. Very useful. A little confusing sometimes, but once you have one working, then this becomes a little bit clearer. All right, so you see this is everything here is based on the To-Do plugin. There's 3 REST services. There's a scheduled task, which is basically what this is from what I can gather. These are the settings that will come up on your configuration when you install the plugin. There'll be a little config button, and these will be in the configuration. And you can use these as like startup scripts for its jQuery, where you can do things like inject some HTML into the main page to create a little button. So if we go over to SailPoint UI, if you have the To-Do plugin installed, you'll be able to see the little button. Let's see if it comes up right here. So that's the little button that gets added by the To-Do plugin. And so let's take a look. So here's the plugin we're going to be looking at. And you see here when you go to the To-Do plugin configuration, you see all those options, and that's what it is. We're not using any since we didn't have any to configure just yet. We may eventually, but right now the whole idea is to keep it simple. All right, so let's see what else we got. Okay, so we went through that a little bit, and over here we have something very useful. This is how you can do API testing using a remote client. So when I'm testing, I have something set up exactly like that, and I can run the API from here using SailPoint Connect. So that's one of my own classes that will pull in all the beans and start up a connection with SailPoint, and then you can run the API that way. All right, so that's a quick going over of the stuff. I'm going to get back here and make sure you get the URLs for these pages here. So, okie dokie. Let's get into it next. All right, so here's our manifest file as we saw in the documentation. Okay, now this is, of course, very simple on purpose. So we have one REST service. We will indeed have a page because it is a UI plugin. We're not using any service executors. We have no scripts and no configuration. So once again, we're keeping it very simple. I also highly recommend you install and learn how to build the To-Do plugin just so you can install it and see how it works. Okay, I'm using NetBeans. NetBeans has a way to modify the build over here. So you can go down into NetBeans and you can create a post clean, so you can clean up the directories, and then post jar. After NetBeans builds the jar, you can then generate the plugin zip file and everything you need accordingly. So that's what I'm doing with NetBeans. Here's our manifest. Okay, so now what we did here is we're going to use a DTO. So we have, this is our DTO. Here are the queries we're running. I don't use the API for queries, only for updates. The queries tend to be faster. So what we're doing here is finding all of the work items that belong to you either as direct owner or in a work group. And here we can use this to get a single managed attribute that we're using to display on the pop-up form. Okay, so here we have all the attributes, getters and setters. Pretty simple bean. Okay, let's get back to here. So now we have our controller. So this is essentially the REST service that we'll be calling from our Angular JS modules and services. So it's called entitlements, and we have a get entitlements, which gets them all. We have a get entitlement with passing the ID to get the one for the display. Then this is the certify button. We set the certify attribute, and then here is where we're resetting it. And let's see. Yeah, I don't think I'm using this one. You have to pretty much do it like this. Okay, so now over here we have, now all of this code is basically calling a service. So here's our service. Okay, so here we got our plugin context, and we can get our SailPoint factory. Now normally you would have a plugin context where you can get to the plugin database, but since we're using the actual SailPoint database here, we're going right to the SailPoint context and not the plugin context. All right, so when we get manage attributes for a user, we're basically running that query and bringing back one user. And here we're getting a managed attribute, getting a single managed attribute. Here we're certifying a single managed attribute, and here is where we reset it. And as we get the records from the database, we create our DTO, and here's where we're setting our certified complete or not. So the window will turn green or not. We'll have to log back in over there. Let's get back here for real quick. Okay, so we have one that's building the list, and then we have another one that's building an individual view. So we're showing more data in the pop-up than we're needing for the actual listing on the table. All right, so that pretty much covers this part, which is actually really pretty standard development process for even for Spring Boot. You know, you would have a controller, you would have services, and you'd have some kind of model. In this case, it would probably be a table, but we're not needing that because SailPoint already has it. So there's also some videos on a plugin that I did on our YouTube site that demonstrates more about how the REST services are done, since that's all it does. This one is going to pretty much concentrate on the UI part, which we're going to jump into next. All right, let's take a look at our page. So this is the page that we're going to load when you click the link. Well, this is the page that SailPoint's going to load for us when we click the link. So here we see our title. Here's our title. And then, so here this is the Angular stuff. So we're saying that's the name of our app. This is the name of our controller. That's the name we're going to use within the page. So you see here, my data, control my data. This is where the list is going to be stored after the REST service returns it. This here is saying if the data is complete or not, we're going to change the color. So here we do this, the data is complete. Well, actually I'm not logged in anymore apparently. Okay. Right. Let's go over here. There we go. So it turns green when you turn on the certify. So that's the complete option. We'll see that here when we're getting our data. We're looking at the status. Where's the code? It's in the service. Yeah. So here when we get our status, if the status is certified, we set complete to true. And that's what causes this to use the success class CSS to turn that line green. And we're also doing similar things here for whether or not we show the button. So you see the button changes to reset as opposed to certify. Okay, so those are just some tricks we're doing in the page. Okay, and here we have when we call our services, we're going to call, view entitlement. We're passing it the entire record here. Here we're passing in just the ID of the managed attribute to do a certify. And then here we're calling the reset method to do a reset, and that's only if it's complete. So if it's not complete, you certify. If it is complete, you reset. And that's really it. So when you build one of these, you pretty much have to copy the SailPoint bundle, which is kind of tacky, really. But anyway, you always have to include your JS module, which is going to have your Angular code. Okay. All right. So let's go take a look at the Angular code. Okay. Let's move into the Angular code now. Let's map it to our page here to start. Okay. So in the page, we're saying we're going to use our insert.js app, and this is the name of our controller, and that's what the name we're going to use inside the page. Okay, if you've done any kind of web development with time leaf or any of that stuff, this should be relatively familiar with what's going on here. The idea being that the REST services are returning the data that you're displaying here. Okay, now this controller has methods: view entitlement, you can certify and reset. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go over how the page initially gets loaded. All right, so your code is all going to be in here. So when you build these pages, you're required to copy this from the SailPoint install, which is a little tacky. You could probably figure out how to use the one that's built in rather than using this URL. But anyway, this is going to be our JavaScript code here. So let's see how the page initially gets loaded. All right, so here is our app. We've already defined that in the page, and we use it to create our Angular module. Our module has a controller. Here's the controller, the name we used in the page for the controller. The controller is got a JS service. It has this thing they call a promise, and our modal dialog. Okay, promises, if you need to know what all that is, you can find it. Basically allows you to do asynchronous things in JavaScript. You'll see it here in a minute. And if you need another explanation of what that queue service does, there's a little bit here. I'm still kind of getting the hang of it, so bear with me. All right, so we defined our service, and we're using our service here. Okay, so let's run down and take a look at the service. The services are actually calling in to our REST services. All right, so we can get our entitlements. We can get one entitlement by ID. We certify an ID, and we reset an ID. And we're using the plugin helper to get our URLs based on our, suffix here. So it's going to fill in the host name and all that stuff for us, which is cool. All right, and all of these methods here are going to be called from our controller. Okay, so it's very similar to what we're doing when you're building a web app. You have a controller that's your REST services, and your service that's actually, going against your database and whatnot. So we're kind of doing the same thing here. All right, so now that we've looked at the service, let's go look and see what happens with the page getting loaded. Okay, the promises are kind of like an init method with these asynchronous things you can do. So as soon as a page gets loaded, we're going to call all the promises. The only one we have is fetching the entitlements. We fetch our entitlements, which is basically calling our service to get the entitlements. We return those entitlements as an array of objects. And then over here, we have the data from this call. And then after the promises are done, we can take the result that's my data and pop it in our bean, I guess, if you could call it that. And here is our array of the list that we're seeing on the page when we first load up. So that's how the initial page gets loaded. Okay, so go back here. Okay, so we went over that. So let's come back and do a little demonstration. All right, let's take a look at what's going on here. We're logged in, we're at the home page. Okay, so now let's see what happens when we initially load this thing. Okay, so you see we're fetching the entitlements. Okay, so if we go back and look at our code, fetch entitlements. That's because this is taken off already, all right, because it knows that they're here by saying promises. So it's already started calling fetch entitlements as part of the initial load. Okay, so now once that's kicked off, it's going to call the service. So we're calling down here now. So this guy ran, kicked off these guys, okay, which is up here. This guy calls the service, that's all the way down here to get the entitlements. This is what we're seeing now, okay. And then once that's done, it's going to return the response, which is an array of our entitlements, or the MA attributes, actually managed attributes from SailPoint. And then once we get those, our service is going to turn them into a DTO that we're going to use to put on the page. And then that's going to be a list of managed attribute, which is our DTO after we convert them in our service. Okay, so we get all of them here from the database, and then for each one we convert it and we put it in here. So let's go back. Now we say okay. Now we see now all the promises are done, and now we finally get to here where we're saying, okay, we called all the promises and now we got our result data, and now we're going to display it. Bingo. And that's really what's going on here. So these buttons are tied to methods. So if we go back and look at our page, these buttons are tied to the methods. So we have view entitlement. We can go here, we can go to view entitlement. Okay, and you see the view entitlement runs our other controller. Okay, and this is where we load our template for our modal dialog. Okay, we'll go into that later. Right now, we just wanted to go over loading the page. All right, so like I said, when we go and get all our entitlements, we're based on the user ID that's logged in, we're running our queries, populating our prepared statement, and then each record we get back from the database, we build the managed attribute based on the data we have back. So for the initial view, we're only loading some attributes. We're not loading them all. For the table, for the view, we're getting some different ones that we want to display in the view. All right, so and we went through how that's all getting called through this JavaScript. All right, so now let's take a look at their other options here. So if we go back to the page again, let's look here. Back to the page, we have the certify button. When you click that, you see after we did the certify, we went and did the fetch again. All right, and now we're going to click the reset button. It's doing the fetch. See that? Okay, so what's happening here is we go look in our code back to our JavaScript module or Angular module. When we click certify, we're telling the code here is saying it's on this controller. This controller has a method called view entitlement. The controller has a method called certify. The controller has a method called reset. And when we call those, we're calling the methods in our service down here, which are actually making the REST calls, right? And right after they make the REST calls, it says, then call me.getEntitlements, which in turn calls the fetch entitlements, then parses the object. This is all part of the asynchronous thing that this promises stuff is doing. So make sure that you updated the object before you actually though try and refresh the page again. At least I think that's how I understand it anyway. All right, so that's how each of the buttons are working, and based on how we populate the model or the DTO object using that complete button, that determines whether or not we get the green background and whether or not we get the certify or reset button. Because once again, it's looking at the data to see what that is, and we set that when we fetched it as part of our conversion to the DTO. All right, so that's how the buttons work. We'll come back and look at that pop-up next. Okay, in the next video coming up, I'm going to talk about this close button that's on the dialog over here, and that I thought it was a built-in type of thing with Angular. Well, I went back and looked right after that, and it turns out there is a close method in here to close the modal dialog. So just so it doesn't cause any confusion. That's it. Thanks. All right, let's see if I can explain this pop-up thing. All right, so we have the view entitlement method in our controller, and it's passing in the entire record. It doesn't really need to, but it is just as an example here. So we pass in the entire record into our method. Now, in order to do this, you have to use this modal service that comes built in with Angular, and it automatically seems to know how to deal with this here. So when we open the dialog, we're telling Angular that here's our controller that we want you to use for any data that we're going to be populating in that pop-up. The actual page lives here, and we're asking the plugin to build the URL for us by telling it the name of the plugin and then the subfolder that template is in for the modal dialog. Okay, and that happens to be here, just like it in here, UI HTML. Okay, and here's our modal dialog. So we already know we're passing in the controller. I didn't bother defining it as it's done here, so I just used the long method of getting what I needed. And these are the values that I'm setting in the service here when I convert to the view model. Okay, so once we do that, then it knows to go run this controller. So now here I didn't use promises, I just ran the init. So as soon as your controller gets control, this is going to be me. so now I run the init method, which calls fetch entitlement. Fetch entitlement then calls my service to get the entitlement based on the ID. So you see fetch entitlement here is getting the entire record, okay, and then we're just using the managed attribute ID to go get the record, and we're using the then option here again too to synchronize, getting the data to display. And so once we do that, the window pops up, and then in the window we have our close button that tells the controller to close. This appears to be built in, and you didn't really have to do anything else to do it. So that's how the modal pop-up is working. And again, all of this was based off of the to-do plugin, but the to-do plugin was very complicated. So the way I managed to figure it out was just breaking it all into a very simple project, and then figuring it out that I could put these alerts in and see what the order of things was going on. And they're still in here for the other parts too. This took me a little bit longer to figure out, but I did manage to get it to work. I'm not sure if this was the proper way in passing in the whole thing, but it does work. So anyway, that wraps up how to use a SailPoint plugin with Angular JS. Hopefully a little simpler explanation than what they have at Compass. Thanks.